Morning, happy Tuesday. So, we're back with the wealth series, and today we're going to be talking about asset protection. We have Harry Barth, which is a nationally recognized speaker on state business and asset protection planning, and he's going to be chatting with us today. And Paul, he's going to be managing the conversation. And at the end of the chat, we will have a Q&A session. So please feel free to ask us any questions that you have on the chat below, whether you are watching on LinkedIn, YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook. We will monitor the questions and then we will ask them at the end. So Paul and Harry, welcome, and the stage is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tade. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm Paul Hitchcock, and I work with Harry Barth. We are Barth Calderon. We are an asset protection, estate planning, and business planning firm located in Orange County, California, with about 5,000 clients across the country. And we work with many families, many business owners. Harry, as I mentioned, is the founder and senior managing partner of the firm and one of our top speakers across the country. So Harry's in high demand for topics such as this, which is exit planning for business owners all across the country to many incredible groups. So we're very excited to be here. And we're going to be also offering you a chance as Harry gets into his talk on how to get one-on-one with Harry and the team for input on your own planning situation. So take notes here. We'll have some Q&A and we'll show you how to get connected to us for a complimentary assessment soon. Harry, take it away.
Well, great. Thank you, Paul. And it's great to be here. And I think as part of the series with some of my other attorneys, you're going to be covering asset protection and estate planning and other strategies. But today's conversation is different. Today's conversation is one of the most difficult strategic, we'll call it initiatives that are taken on by any business owner, and it's colloquially known as succession planning and or exit planning. And so I think we start with a cliche or an analogy that's extremely important for everyone to understand that every single business owner will exit the business stage. Every single one. There's not a single one that does not exit. The question in the plan is whether it's a voluntary exit. We'll talk about how that happens, and we'll talk a little bit about an involuntary exit. But in every respect, exit planning must get done. Now, in exit planning, we cross over a little bit into some, we'll call it psychological aspects of those of us that may have built our businesses. It's our baby. We've watched it grow from the very, very beginning to where it is as we begin to think about an exit. And psychologically, sometimes it's very difficult to let go. So, although we may have all the greatest financial and legal strategies, we also have to be psychologically prepared for Act Two when we depart our businesses. So, when we talk about exit planning, some interesting concepts and ideas come to play. Well, first, let's talk a little bit about um, an involuntary exit. Now, an involuntary exit is one that's not relatively well planned out. And what happens in many businesses on an involuntary exit, we wind up in a business liquidation. It's over, it's done, the business is liquidated, it's finished, and we just didn't have an exit. We didn't have a plan. So I think it's important when we talk about exit strategies, and the first we're going to cover, we get to the voluntary, the involuntary exits. We should talk a little bit about what causes an involuntary exit. But before I even get to what causes an involuntary exit, there's another very important concept that we need to understand. And I find this so amazing that the first part of exit planning is current financial planning. You know, the question is how much income do we need? What expenses do we have? What does the world look like after the exit? Are we fiscally able to exit at the price and terms that may or may not be offered to us? So I
Harry, you
think
say
the
you do this up front when someone's talking about their exit plan. Start with the financial
Absolutely.
plan
The
in the
first thing
beginning.
is we got to know what the income is, what the expenses are, what other sources of income that we have, and what is the after-tax net dollars that may be achieved by the exiting owners, because that's what we have to work with.
Yeah.
And when we put that all together, does it meet the needs, the lifestyle that takes place? Are we going to have a successful exit? So I think that that's important. I think in every single plan, whether we're dealing involuntarily or voluntarily, we need to know what are the numbers that we need to achieve under all the circumstances that we have. And that all begins with a financial plan. But I think let's take all the various different components um, that we have to deal with on an exit. So on an involuntary exit, the first one that comes to mind for so many, sadly, excuse me, is death.
Yeah.
So upon death, we've made an exit. Stage right, and out we go. And so there are so many issues that come to play. There are tax issues, income issues, probate issues, just issues one after another, and the ability to deal with what happens on death, liquidity. The business has lost many times has lost its financing. The personal guarantees from the owners
The
that have
business goes
taken place.
under, right?
Business can go under very, very easily. Got a loss of a key person and it's unplanned, and we don't have a succession plan.
Yeah.
So one of the things in dealing with what I call a control agreement, some people known as colloquially as a buy-sell agreement, is we talk about these triggers and what are our plans for those triggers. So if we exit involuntarily via death, all right, we have a couple of issues that we all face. One we face is what is the impact on the business if you're a key person in the business? And what is the business? How much sales are going to be lost? Relationships that are going to be lost, fiscal situations that are going to be lost. Does the business have an influx, for example, of working capital at that moment, which comes usually via what is known as key person life insurance, to make sure that that business can survive, albeit even temporarily. The other thing too is where's it going to go? So 75 to 80% of business owners, when I talk with them and work with them, they would like to see if they have family that's in the business, they would like to see the children or the family take over the business and still have the business continue to run. Uh, Others might have key management that's been developed over the years, and maybe key management would like to take over the business. But what's interesting on that exit is that although we may have key people or senior management that's willing to take over and run the business, and or children to be in the business, they are lacking one thing. They are lacking capital. They have no money in which to pay a surviving spouse or equalize the inheritance amongst the other children. So the
Yeah.
key management people, the ones that would probably be the best, and or the children that are in the business, believe it or not, even though that's the plan, 75% of the time the business is sold to an outside third party because they're the ones with the necessary capital to take over the business. And then we have sometimes management problems and or family problems that come as a result. It's just from a lack of planning that needs to take place. So one of the things we need to do is determine who are the potential benefactors of the business in the event of our deaths, and then put together a cogent plan so the business can transition and there's a way for all the proper people to be appropriately and properly paid. Now, another trigger that creates an exit from our business involuntarily is a disability or an incapacity. This one is quite significant. I recently worked with a franchisee of a very, very large organization, and there were two owners of the business, 50-50 each. One of the owners had reached into his late 80s and had lost most of his cognitive abilities. And his
Mm.
spouse, who was his designated power of attorney, also had lost much of her cognitive abilities. And as a result of that, they refused to sign loan documents for expansion. Franchisor was very concerned about whether or not to grant a franchise for them. There was an inordinate need for money on their part, yet they could no longer contribute to the business. So we can have a situation where incapacity comes along to a co-owner or even to the owner. And if it happens to the owner, then who's going to step in? Do we have to get a court-appointed conservator? Have we named a proper management to take over the business with the use of an appropriate power of attorney uh, to make sure that the business is able to continue to be run during a period of the owner's incapacity? And then after a certain period of time, maybe we do have an option whereby the management, if properly planned, can buy out the business from the incapacitated owner, or the children. Can We could put together a succession plan for the children to deal with what happens in the event of incapacity. And remember
Harry,
that.
just one
Okay,
quick thing that
sure.
you're saying, a big point is if you're in business with somebody else, they better have their estate planning in order. That is part of an exit, a successful
Yeah,
exit plan. Yes?
very, 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 very important to do that as part of a successful exit and part of a continued success of the business unto itself, because it may not be us who are victimized; it could be our partners who are
Right.
victimized, and we are now no longer dealing with our partners, but we're dealing with our partners' powers of attorney. Those are holding the powers as successor attorneys, in fact. So I think it's very important in a global look that in our exit planning, we recognize that death or incapacity could cause an exit, and we need to have a game plan in place as to who the buyers should be or shouldn't be, or who takes over and how it works. And it gets quite complex, and I think something that needs to be looked at. Takes years to look at it to make sure that we have a proper succession plan in place. Um, another one that a lot of people don't think about, and some of my associates will be talking to all of you about, is the fact that if we are involved in a liability, a significant liability, if the owner is involved in a significant liability, and the owner, as a result of that, loses their ownership interest in the business, it's the same as making an involuntary exit. What happened there? So can the business be structured in such a way as to insulate the the business from the liabilities of the owner? We're always concerned about, you know, protecting the owner from the liabilities of the business, but I think it's just as important, if not equally important, to protect the business from the liabilities of the owners, because the business can be just as lost as much as if there was a death and or an incapacity. And once again, who the anointed, whether it be children, a management buyout group, or a sale to an outside third party, that we have the appropriate legal tools and procedures in place to make what is an involuntary exit a transition that can go smoothly and work effectively. Now, it's interesting when you look at the statistics of businesses moving from generation to generation. It's amazing that only about 33% of businesses make it from generation one to generation two.
That's amazing.
67% of them fail, and from generation two to generation three, only about 7 or 8% of businesses do. And to me, that dismal figure comes because one, we have not planned for an involuntary or for an exit, have not done the appropriate financial planning, have not done the appropriate exit planning. We haven't planned for the contingencies. We don't have our legal document in place. We have family squabbles that are coming to play, and potentially significant tax issues. And
Right.
on the involuntary exit, not only do we have to take a look at other things, but if in the event of a death, and if that death creates potentially a federal and or state taxes that have to come to play, we need to find a way to raise the money to pay the taxes so we have a successful transition. Um, when you have a large business, it usually represents a significant portion of someone's estate. And if it's subject to taxation, we have a problem. Now, there are a couple of provisions in the Internal Revenue Code and in many state codes that allow for an installment sale of the business, to pay the taxes when a business is such a large piece. But think about that, we're leaving the next generation or the successor owners with uh, a large burden because the governments usually place a lien all over business assets in order to pay the taxes. And it's very
Right.
difficult to try to get financing for inventory expansion or anything else when we have governmental liens on the property. So it's not necessarily the greatest solution in the world. And the other thing too is I like to call it when we have not a single owner but several owners of a business, which happens many times in LLCs, corporations, partnerships, is I like to call it a control agreement because, for example, if I die and my wife owns my 1/3 of the business and we don't have a proper plan, my other two 1/3 owners are now in business with my wife. And this may be, they may have had a great relationship with me. They may have a cordial relationship with my spouse. My spouse doesn't know anything about running the business. And now all of a sudden there's 1/3 ownership. And you think about it, how do the 2/3 owners feel about developing a business for the benefit of a 1/3 owner that's passive sitting on the side? They don't, so they want to buy them out. And then, of course, my wife may think it's worth more than it's worth, right? There's no path to the sale. There's no pre-organized price, no pre-organized valuation, no pre-organized means of paying for that,
Could,
and
could
it
get
leads
ugly.
to it could get very very ugly. And let me give you an example of a succession plan gone bad. To give you an example of so, and this is a small scenario. It's a dental practice. We had two dental practitioners, an older practitioner, and a younger practitioner. And it was always that the younger practitioner was going to take over the business or the practice from the older practitioner. And they even had life insurance involved in order so the younger practitioner would have the money necessary to pay the older practitioner's family if something happened to the older practitioner. They had an appropriate and properly designed, I will say appropriate, not positive, properly designed control agreement. And sadly, the older practitioner did have a massive heart attack, and the younger practitioner needed to step up immediately because when you had the older practitioner that had many of the relationships, contacts, and patients over the years, it was very important to the younger practitioner to maintain that, to
Yeah.
step in there, maintain that, make sure that the records were there, let the people know that services were going to continue in the practice. And they had the money and they had the agreement. But what they didn't do is the older practitioner's ownership interest in the dental corporation was not encapsulated inside a living revocable trust. It was just owned in the doctor's name. So although the younger doctor was there with a check for $400,000 from the insurance company to pay the spouse of the deceased practitioner, and she needed the money because she just lost all of her income when her husband passed, she did not have the legal ability to sell it. She did not have
Ay, ay,
ownership
ay.
of the stock. So we had the money, we had the agreement, but the inability to legally carry it out. So that means that that stock had to wind up in a probate court and wind up with months and months and months, potentially we'll call it bureaucratic red tape before the spouse received the ability to actually transact it and get the $400,000. And almost many times that situation will fail. the business will be lost. The other person will walk away. There'll be litigation over the amount of money because they'll say it's no longer worth it, and they'll say that the agreement was nullified, and it goes on and on and on. Had somebody just taken a proper look on the involuntary exit planning, and made sure that all of the pieces fit into the appropriate, we'll call it positions, then that would have been seamless, and within a day it would have been done, avoiding all those particular problems. So one of the things that I think is very, very, very important, whether it be a voluntary or an involuntary exit from a business, is to do a legal checkup. All right, a legal
Right.
checkup to make sure that every aspect of that business legally, contracts, buy sell agreements, estate plans, you know, leases, employee records, everything are up to date and pristine. And let me give you that's so important in an involuntary death or incapacity or asset protection liability. If everything is pristine and in place, it will move seamlessly to accomplish the goals and the objectives. If we have senior management, for example, that's willing to buy out the business, we know the price and the terms and how they're going to buy it out, how it's going to be funded, who's going to hold the paper, how the security interest is going to be done, who has the ability to carry it out and not carry it out. Management takes over. All right. The spouse or the family of the deceased person or the incapacitated person or the victimized person is appropriately and properly compensated, and we had a successful exit. Not involuntary or never happy exit, but a successful exit. And we knew what we needed from dollars and cents because we did a preliminary financial plan to make sure that it takes place. Now, this is a mouthful of stuff. Basically, an exit plan takes several years of putting it together, of a lot of thoughts and a lot of psychological angst and all the plans and all the data. But let me tell you something that's very important about the value that's going to be received by the family, whether voluntary or involuntary, even if I was selling it to third party, by having everything in place and properly done, I'm telling you, will increase the value of that business by close to 20%. Now, think of it, Paul. If you were coming into a business and you were
Right.
considering buying a business, it's in the target, it's a place that you want to do, and you meet with ownership and management, and you begin to do, as usual, your due diligence in that process. And you see that all the leases, the contracts, the payroll, the buy sells, all of the formalities, the minutes, everything that needs to be done for that business is done and pristine
I'll
and
pay more.
great.
I'll pay more money
That
for it.
you're going to pay more money for that business. On the other hand, you walk in and all those records are either missing, shoddy, or not done. Your price is coming down, and the cost to the family is exceedingly high. So I would strongly suggest a legal checkup, whether it be a voluntary or an involuntary
Yeah.
exit.
Well,
And
Harry, you speaking to the 50-point checkup we do. It's interesting because I know when we do that, it's just 90% of the businesses they're messy. They need
yeah,
help.
they are, and this is a very important part of exit planning. Now, the other parts of exit planning that are critical are one of the things when we talk about making an exit. So one thing is if we're making let's switch for a moment to a voluntary exit. So we've picked the time. There comes a time where we decide voluntarily to make an exit. And like I said, 75% of the time when we speak to entrepreneurs about that, yes, they have management that wants to take over, or if they're lucky enough, they have children that have, developed over the years in the business and they want to take over. And like I said, 75% of the time it's actually sold to an outside third party because no planning was absolutely done. And all of a sudden, the exitor, me who wants to leave the business, really can't afford because the people that are going to take over the business and going to pay me for the business, which I have to rely upon because it was 85% of my net worth, have no money. And the only security for the business is the business itself. And if the business goes down, I have nothing. So I would rather sell to a third party and take all of the cards off the table. I could sleep better at night. So we talked a little bit about in the proper legal checkup, having all of the legal documents and every aspect legally and financially of the business pristine will add to the increase of the price. There's another one that's very important. So if I was coming in and buying a business from you, Paul, and your business is producing widgets and you have a factory and a
Mm.
good management team, I'm very concerned about whether or not your top management team is going to stay with me or they're going to leave. And if I know that the management team that you have is going to be in place and is going to stay, I will pay so much more for that business if you're selling to an outside third party. So I think it's very important as part of our exit planning, so to speak. So what can we do to keep management in place? And one of the concepts that we've worked with over the years is something which is known as a stay bonus. So in applying a stay bonus, basically I'm saying to my people, look, well, Paul says to his people, look, I'm going to sell the business. It's a great opportunity with the new owner. And in addition to whatever the new owner is going to offer you as compensation, if you're still here at the end of 2 years, you know, Paul will give you a bonus based upon X dollars that on top of everything else that you would have received or irrespective of your compensation from the new owner, Harry. If you
Yeah.
stay, if you leave that behind. You'll be surprised and I may have to spend X dollar for the stay bonus, but I will make that up tremendously in the purchaser dollars to me because they're going to pay me more. They know in all probability that my top management team is going to stay for at least a couple of years. And
Yeah.
talking about top management teams and exit and growth, I think it's very important that we find ways in our exit planning to lock in or provide golden handcuffs to our top management team to keep them there, you know. And we do that many times through phantom stock or phantom membership appreciation rights plans, where our top and key people can participate with us in the fortunes of the business yet without having them actually be owners of the business with all the inherent flaws associated with
Right.
that. So I like to see various forms of deferred compensation, which encourages people to stay with the company. And you have phantom plans and stock appreciation plans and non-qualified deferred compensation plans. And don't get me wrong, retirement plans as well, and helping my key people with building their financial coffers so they can have the financial wherewithal to purchase the business from my family.
Right.
So, it may sound like a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, but given enough time, we have ways to lock in our top management team. If our top management team stays, our profitability goes up. If our profitability goes up, we get a higher price when it's paid for. So I think that that's a very important point. There also another point that I want to bring uh, to everybody's attention is taxation. So when we sell a business and we look about the value that we're going, it's not the value that we sold for that goes into our financial plan. It's the amount of dollars that we actually keep. And there's taxation, there's some is ordinary income, most is capital gains, depending upon the state. It could be 20% federal under current law, up to 5 to 13% for state that goes along the way. So it's really sometimes 33 to 40%, 33% less, a third less is the amount of money that we have to deal with if we didn't do any tax planning or tax considerations. So and I'll give you an example of that. Let me give you an example that, let's say that Paul, you own a corporation, and as many corporations are, it's elected to be taxed as an S corporation, and I am a key employee or child. Um, and I want to buy that business from you on the
Yeah.
exit. And you've said, look, I've had
Yeah.
enough. I want to go and do different things in Act Two of my life. So we work very, very hard. We do a non-binding letter of intent. We have a purchase and sale contract, and we get a valuation and we get a price. And in many times, Paul, I'm buying from you. Since I don't have money, very much money, I'm not going to be able to get financing from a third party institution in order to pay you. So, Paul, you're going to be a bit of the banker, and I'm going to pay you over a period of time in order to
Right.
do that and secure it by the business. That puts you in an untenable position. You switch from
Right.
being an owner to a creditor, and we go and there's some tax issues and problems. I just want to give you a classic example. So when you sell to me, when I pay you, usually that's considered a capital event. And if I pay you $100,000 a year, you're going to have to pay, call it $30,000 of taxes on that, and keep $70,000. In order for me to pay you $100,000, because I have the S corporation from you, um, I'm going to have to pay taxes. So when I get my company earns the money, the company's going to pay taxes on that. I'm going to pay taxes in my tax bracket, which could be 30, 40%. And then after that 30, 40%, then I'm going to have the money in order to pay you. So I went through 30, 40% on one side, and then you're paying 33% on the other side. That's quite a big of a tax
Big.
vacuum that has to
Right.
go through, and it makes it much more difficult for the future viability of the business. So if we were a little bit creative in the way in which we did it, maybe we changed it and you sold it to me at the lowest defensible price. I know you always want the highest price, but you sell it to me at the lowest defensible price that you could sell it to me for. Excuse me. And when you do that, that is goes through that taxation, we'll call it vacuum. But to make up the differential, instead, how about you giving me or me giving you, more likely, I'm sorry, a covenant not to compete against me. I don't want you to open up Paul's widgets across the street. So I'll
Right.
pay you $50,000 a year for a non compete agreement not to compete with me. Now, that $50,000 that I pay is a deductible expense for my business and it's taxable income to you, but I could take a deduction for that.
Nice.
So it's easier for me to pay you that $50,000 a year. And since you had that business for the last 30 years, maybe we turn around and I provide you a consulting agreement so you can consult with me on the things that I need to know, help me with customers and process and things of that nature. So, one, it's helpful for me, and two, I can pay you a consulting fee, which once again will be deductible to the business and taxable income to you.
Nice.
So, by
Nice.
using a combination of the purchase and sale agreement, non compete agreements, and consulting agreements, we may be able to bring a much better price and structure along the way. So, so involuntary. We talked about involuntary, and we talk again about voluntary. Um, we need to define buyers. We need to define financial plans. We need to have all legal things that are done properly and make sure everything fits in the appropriate spots. And we need to do the best that we can to mitigate the tax strategies to lower the tax burdens as best as we can on the buyer and the seller to make that successful. And again, all this may sound great, but do you have the overarching psychological aspect of what am I going to do now that I've sold my business to you?
Right.
And
Right.
the other, and we also need to understand um, sometimes it's a sole-owned business, sometimes it's partners buying out other partners or corporate shareholders or redemption by the corporation as a means of an exit. Those are all voluntary exits. They're wonderful. They can be planned successfully, and then we have all the involuntary exits that I spoke about earlier. So important to keep the management team in place, provide golden handcuffs, provide stay options to keep management people in place. These all build value in my business. We had
Right.
an interesting business. You would all know what it is. So we won't turn around and talk about their name, but at one point when we first got in and talked about an exit, the two partners wanted to exit the business. They were entertaining at that point numbers of around $5 to $6 million for their business. So outside parties were willing to pay $5 to $6 million to the business. we elected not to sell. And we elected to employ all of the strategies that we just talked about, stay bonuses, locking in management, making sure everything was legally perfect and pristine. And we put it off for 5 years. And 5 years later, we sold that business for $23 million. So these things do work and they're very, very helpful. Yes, there are marketplace conditions and things that happen along the way, but there's so much that is in our control. And so exit and growth strategies today can only talk, on a very, very 36,000-foot level as to what we need to look at. And so, what is my suggestion to all of our listeners? Our listeners to talk about is that, yeah, it's good. Why don't we just sit and chat? We'll provide everybody with a complimentary consultation. Let's talk about voluntary and involuntary exits. Let's see what you've done so far, and God forbid, an involuntary exit. Let's see what you've done so far in planning for a voluntary exit and the finances that are involved. Let's chat. Let's put together a strategy, and I think we'll come a long way in helping all of our business owners achieve those goals and objectives in an area that has been one of the most challenging because there is no one size fits all, and everything is black and white. So, Paul, why don't you have questions? Let's do some questions and answers now, if we can. We should let everybody in the audience know how to reach us and to reach me to discuss this further, and that would be great.
Yeah, and I was going to share the screen. Great talk, Carrie. So, Tide, I shared the screen. I don't know if it's up there. There it goes. So, what I want to say there is for anybody out there, you got any questions on anything that Harry brought up here today, you want to get one-on-one for a free strategy session, you want to text guard assets to that phone number. So write that down, take a snapshot of that, text guard assets to that number, and then you'll be taken to a calendar where you can pick a time for your initial intake call. That's how that works. And whether it's estate planning, business planning, you know, that's how you get connected to us. So take advantage of that. Okay. I think we're gonna Tide, you're coming back on here. There you are. And you're
Oh,
muted. You're muted.
you're muted.
My apologies. There you are.
There you are.
So we have a few questions for Harry. The first one is how and why insurance can be used in estate planning or exit my business.
Well, yes, insurance is a very, very, very important component. You have the nature of the insurance and how it's constructed, type of insurance, insurance organizations, length, type, premium, and it's used in several different ways. Um, First, as I said earlier, if the business suffers a loss, and now we're talking about death, but we're talking about life insurance primarily, the business needs capital. I haven't seen a business situation that hasn't lost an owner that needs capital. They just need capital. It's just the business is in shock. In order for the business to get past that, they need some capital. So that's called key person insurance. It's traditionally owned by the entity, and the entity is the beneficiary, and it's really good. And you know what? It makes key management people feel better, employees feel better, and it makes creditors feel better too, because you've signed on the bottom line for all the things to know that in the event of your untimely death, that we have a slug of capital that's going to come into the business. The other way that insurance is used in exit planning, is that when somebody dies, it provides a ready source of funds to the other members of the LLC or the other partners or the other shareholders. So they have the money if they're going to buy out the deceased owner's interest in the company rather than an installment plan. So in a control agreement, there are usually insurance provisions that are built in, and sometimes you can't afford to insure the whole purchase, but you can even insure to pay a down payment of 50%. So 50% is paid for by insurance and an installment plan secured by the business. So the interaction is always better if it's insured. We threw the risk to the insurance company. The third party takes on the risk of that tremendous loss if the business can afford to do so. So it's used quite effectively and quite frequently. But there's an interesting factor that has to be built in here. So I've been in practice doing this stuff for 50 years. And the question is and when we talk about exits, one of the first things that comes to mind is death. What happens if the business owners or one of the owners or the owner dies? And all of this comes about. And the reality is that maybe only 10 to 15% of the time does a business owner die while in full control of the business. But we're concerned about that 100% of the time. More likely than not, the business would have been sold. They had an equity event. They actually retired, and the management or their kids bought them out, or they sold to a third party. So those things are very, very important. But yet we put an over concentration on death. So let's just keep that in mind.
Perfect. The other question that we have is like, what are some of the important documents you need to have to plan your state?
Okay, and planning your estate, the documents that are critically important are one, appropriate and proper powers of attorney are really, really important. So, in the event of an income, who's going to take over? All right, who's going to make decisions? Who's going to run the business? Who's going to write the checks? Who's going to take care of all that? If we don't have that title, what happens is we have to wind up in court getting a conservatorship, which could take months and is very, very expensive. And so, a power of attorney and you can have two powers of attorney. You can have a power of attorney for your spouse or family for all personal related things, and have a different power of attorney for the business. You don't have to have one. You can have many that serve different components along the way. Next important document, of course, is having a trust to make sure that the business transitions to whether it be an outside buyer or an inside buyer without the necessary of going through court procedures at a state level that could tie up a business for 2 to 3 years. And it's not public; it's private. So that's extremely important. And I always find it very, very important. You have more than one owner, or you have competent management, or one child in the business and three children not in the business, an appropriate and proper buy sell slash control agreement for the business. Those are the basic documents. We have those documents there and they're done properly. I think we have a very good shot at a reasonable transition.
That's perfect. Um, we have another question here. It's like, how do I says like, how do I convince my partners to have an exit plan for our company?
Well, I think
Uh,
the question is that's a very, very good question. It's part of the psychological issues that we talked about.
Yeah.
And how does one convince the partners? Well, just go the other way around and say, well, we don't know which of the partners are going to have an exit.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know which one becomes incapacitated. We all think it's the other guys. It could be them. And then how do they realize the value for their families and all the work that they put in? So I think the best way, the way that we've always done that, is you take if you have three partners or so, whatever it may be. Let's sit down. Let's have a complimentary consultation and talk a little bit about. I just throw things up. What happens if someone dies? What happens if someone's incapacitated? What happens? How do we move from between partners? How do we do that? What are your plans? How is it funded? What are the tax issues? And that will usually raise enough of a question to encourage people to at least consider and should consider the most important of documents to have a good exit. So I
yeah,
think it's just a good question of
yeah, and
conversation.
I was going to say too, Tade, just on what Harry was saying, is that initial complimentary session there, really, Harry and the team, they articulate sort of the playbook for you, whatever it is. If you don't have an estate plan and you need to get that going, imperative to get that going, that's laid out. And then how is that integrated with the business? So it's just about getting that information out there initially, getting your playbook, and that's what we deliver for you.
And as a follow up question to the last one, Harry, what do you recommend to do when the partners can agree on a sales price?
Oh yeah, well that is we see that all the time. And so when we build a exit plan or a control agreement, we start with the best way to deal with it is to have an agreed upon value. So we all know if the three of us here can agree upon the value for our business, that's good. And then we adjust that price every 12 months or so, up or down, based upon all factors and conditions. But we also recognize exactly what you said can happen, that we don't agree, or we've had an agreement, now we have a disagreement, or we just couldn't even agree up front, even though we've had potential valuation or no valuation, we just don't agree. So when we write the agreement, we turn around and say that if we don't have an agreed upon price, which they could do it subsequently, then we bring in independent third party appraisers. So the company will bring in appraiser who will appraise the value of the business and their ownership value of the business at the time of the event.
Mm,
And then the other, we build in that, if the company's appraiser, you don't like that, then you could challenge the company's appraiser and have your own appraiser. And if the appraisers are more than 10% apart, then with the two of them will submit their findings to a third appraiser, and then we have a finalized agreement. So you're always going to have a finalized agreement. But the question is, what's the path to that? So when you see
Right.
that you're going to have that path with the appraisers, it's more incentive to see if we get an agreement from the partners for today and how it's adjusted. But we always have a means that's built in. Otherwise, we'll call it the paralysis that occurs in a business when we're unable
mm.
to execute a proper um, exit, winds up more often than not, if you don't have that, in a liquidation of a lifelong business, and that was just
Horrible.
horrible.
Yeah, I can imagine. Um, I have two more questions. How does a
Sure.
credit shelter trust work for married couples?
Well, a credit shelter trust is known by many names: non family trust, non marital trust, bypass trust. So all that means today is, in a living revocable trust or another trust, it's a trust that happens when one spouse dies. You need spouses for this to happen. One spouse dies, we put into we divide the assets and into the credit shelter trust. It shelters the credit. So right now, for example, the estate tax credit under current law is $12 million. So we could put up to one half, up to $12 million in a credit shelter trust. And the purpose of that, from a tax perspective, is that $12 million that's in that credit shelter trust can grow to any, could go to $30 million or $40 million of appreciating assets. And on the second death, the assets in the credit shelter, because it sheltered the credit, will not be subject to estate tax. So everything that grows, plus it's asset protected, all
Mm,
right. Plus it kind of makes sure that the deceased spouse's wishes are carried out. So that's we have all these names: credit shelter, bypass, non-marital. It's all the same thing. It's just basically a box. So if we had $20 million, we'd put $10 million in the credit shelter trust and $10 million in the survivors trust, and that $10 million is special for estate tax purposes, and makes sense from an estate planning view for most married couples.
mm. Yeah, interesting.
And the last question.
Yeah, the last one it says there are more and more families these days where there are multiple marriages. How can a parent help ensure that the children from the first marriage get the inheritance the parent will like them to have?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And probably I spend 25 to 30% of my time dealing with that. So that's the whole purpose of a trust. So when I die, my wife and I die, and assets move to our children, we set up guardrails and borders of the trust for my child to make sure that that trust is for my child, and then my grandchildren, and my great grandchildren. And by doing that properly, it'll prevent those assets from moving to spouse or spouses of my child. So that's all done in the form of a trust. Excuse me.
Nice. Perfect. Well, Paul, I don't know if you have any other questions, but those are the ones that we got throughout the chat.
No, those are great. It's been fantastic. Thank you for having us. And again, people a lot of times want to get one-on-one with us. Happy to get into a strategy session with them. But yeah, and thank you, Harry.
Oh, thank you guys. My
Yeah, no,
pleasure.
thank you, Harry. It was very
We look forward to
insightful.
many more sessions with you guys.
No, for sure, it was very insightful. And remember, you Paul shared the number for the session, and there is also a link in the description of this video for a free consultation. So, thank you very much
All right. Thank you
for
guys, and
watching,
take
and
care of
please
yourself.
make sure that you share these videos because I mean Harry just shared a boatload of knowledge in the
Good
last
stuff.
45 minutes and really, really good stuff that you guys need to consider for your business and for your financial planning. So thank you, everyone. Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you.
Thank you,
Bye
Tade.
bye.
Have a great day. Thank you.